Okay, and can I just check, can you see the screen full size? If someone could tell me.
Yep.
I can see it fine, yes.
Okay, that's great. So this afternoon, these are the things we're going to cover. There's quite a lot there, as you can see. So really, as I mentioned last week, it's really to give you an overview of the subjects rather than a deep dive. So we're going to cover customs, general obligations, we're going to cover shipping and logistics, insurance, and we're going to end up with documentation. Just like last week, we will have the break at round about 2:30. We'll find a natural point around about that is 2:30 UK time, which is UTC +1. So we'll have a break around 2:30 for half an hour, and then we'll continue. As Polina said, please do ask questions, please make comments. Just to reiterate what I said last week, that I'm very, very informal. If you want to stop me while I'm talking, I have no problem with that whatsoever. If you want to ask a question straight away, I'll pause regularly for any questions, but you don't have to wait until I've paused. If you want to ask something, please do, or even if you just want to make a comment, then please feel free to do that. So we'll start off with customs obligations. Legal formalities are the same in every country. There's no difference. There's a legal obligation to declare cargoes at export and at import. And it is legally the responsibility of the importer of record or the exporter of record to do that. So what that means is, even if you use freight forwarders, agents, customs brokers, they're acting, and I'll talk more about this later on, they're acting as your direct representative. And that means even though they carry out the act of entering the declaration into the customs management system of the country concerned, you as the trader, you as the importer or exporter, you have the legal responsibility for what they're entering. If they make a mistake, it's you who will get into trouble, not the broker, not the freight forwarder, not the agent. So a legal obligation to declare cargoes at import and at export. For import, there's an obligation to pay any duties that may be payable, plus any domestic taxes like GST or VAT. There's a legal obligation to comply with import regulations, including prohibitions, restrictions, and controls. Every country has prohibitions and restrictions. In customs terminology, they talk about P's and R's, prohibitions and restrictions, and they include things like export and import controls. Again, a very, very important area, and a very, unfortunately, a very complex area. In fact, I'm working with UNCTAD, UNCFAT at the moment, to try and design and implement a global system to manage export controls, because there's a huge problem globally with importers and exporters getting them wrong, mainly exporters getting them wrong. We did touch on this last week, but I think, the biggest kind of, if you like, danger zone, the biggest danger area is dual use goods. And a dual use product is application. And, very, very often items are shipped around the world. The exporter doesn't realize that product. It may be electrical, it may be a mineral, it may be a piece of equipment, it may be a piece of clothing, without realizing that it has a dual use. It could be used for military use, and that would come under the dual use regulation, and that would mean the exporter would need an export license and very, very strict penalties, very, severe implications for exporting something without a license when it should have a license. So, it's incumbent on the exporter to do the checks under the HS code, under the controls list, to see if the product they're moving is controlled or not. If it's a dual use product, it means the exporter must apply for an export license. In most cases, that license would be issued, in most cases, and then they're free to ship the goods. But clearly, if the goods are dual use and no license has been issued, those goods may not leave the country concerned. Also compliance to legal obligation to meet the rules of origin. Again, unfortunately, a very, very complex subject. We touched on this last week, remembering that we have two types of origin. We have non-preference origin, which is where the exporter proves origin for a reason not connected with a trade agreement. And we have preference origin, where the exporter proves origin when it's connected with the trade agreement. And we have very, very stringent rules under the rules of origin. Again, unfortunately, only too often exporters declare an origin without having checked the rules of origin. And, it may not be the right origin. And very, very big penalties for exporters if they don't declare correct origin, and also for importers if they use a declaration of origin which is not correct and get a duty advantage, sometimes not paying any duty whatsoever because they're declaring an origin declared by the exporter. They're declaring that origin on import, but it doesn't meet the rules of origin. So what it really comes down to is good due diligence on behalf of the exporter and on behalf of the importer. And of course, getting all this done, proving origin, ensuring you're complying with regulations, making sure the right HS code is being used, the declaration is correct, that can have implications on timescales in your supply chains. Okay, any questions or comments on that as a gentle introduction? Okay, so every country, I'm using a UK example here, but it's the same in every country. Every country will have normally three sets of regulations on customs operations that traders have to adhere to. They've got to comply with the regulations. Every country will have a CEMA, a Customs and Excise Management Act. The terminology is a CEMA. And that CEMA will be the Act of Parliament. It will be the legislation in the country allowing customs to carry out their role. So there will be a Management Act. And that, in most countries, that'll be an Act of Parliament, depending on the nature of the government. But there will be some kind of legislation empowering the customs authority to do what they do. And in many countries, just like the UK, and I'm using the UK as an example because that's where I'm sitting at the moment, but just like the UK, customs authorities very, very often have more power even than the police. And that's certainly the case in the UK. So there will be a Customs and Excise Management Act, and there will be a customs code. Again, the customs code, which is basically all the customs regulations, is very, very similar in every country. The reason it's similar is because the World Customs Organization, they have a code called the Revised Kyoto Convention. It's called that, not surprisingly, because it was signed in Kyoto. And the Revised Kyoto Convention, if you like, is the blueprint for how customs have to operate in every country. So every country's customs code will actually be a pull from the Revised Kyoto Convention. There won't be any great surprises there. So, for example, if you compared the UK customs code with the Union customs code in the European Union, there's not much difference because every customs code is based on the Revised Kyoto Convention. But what may differ a little bit from country to country would be the implementing provisions. So you get the customs code, which is all the operations of customs authorities, things like, well, everything, duty reliefs, HS code, tariffs, everything is going to be on there. And then you'll have the implementing provisions, which is how it actually works in practice. So every country is going to have those three things. They're going to have a CEMA, there's going to be a customs code, and then there's going to be implementing provisions of that customs code. So if we dig down into a little bit more detail on the legal obligations, we've got the declaration of cargo. Really important for authorities because not only, for import consignments, will the declaration trigger if any duty has to be paid, and importantly, the amount of duty that has to be paid, but the import and export declarations, they are the only way countries get statistical information on what's going out and what's coming into the country. In other words, it's the only way they get trade statistics, balance of payments. The only way you get those is from import and export declarations. And every country wants to know what's going in, what's going out. They want to know the value. They want to know the method of transport. They want to know the commodity code. They want to know if there's any preferential origin, which is being attached to that particular consignment. So, those are key elements that they want to get. And the only way they do that is by the declarations, the import and export declarations. Because of that, if there's even the smallest mistake in a declaration, there can be a prosecution. It's a customs offence because you're misdeclaring. And that can mean even a 1-digit wrong on the commodity code is a misdeclaration and it can result in a penalty. So the good practice there is, in Europe, actually in most countries now, it's very, very normal to use third-party providers to do declarations. Most traders don't have the facility to input directly into customs management systems, although it's becoming more and more usual for traders to do that. But now I think, it is true to say that globally, most importers and exporters use freight forwarders, customs brokers, agents to do the declarations. But do remember, if the broker makes a mistake, it's the trader, the importer or exporter that will get into trouble because of that mistake. That's really important to remember. Keeping good records is always an obligation. And remembering for export, in most countries, if you export, you don't have to charge local tax. You don't have to charge VAT, GST, whatever the local tax is called. But you can only avoid charging that if you retain proof of export. And that proof of export will normally be a copy of the transport document concerned, or sometimes it will be a copy of the export customs declaration. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, compliance with export regulations, including controls and prohibitions, is of course crucial to customs compliance. Now, the problem is, if you're an exporter or an importer and you don't know the controls and prohibitions, how do you know you're getting it right? So part of compliance, a really important part of compliance is ensuring that and it comes down to the next point, ensuring you've identified the correct commodity code for the product and checking that commodity code in the implementing code of customs, in the control list, and so on and so on. And with the commodity code, remember, the first 6 digits of the commodity code will come under the HS system, the harmonized system. And the harmonized system of commodity coding is owned by the World Customs Organization. It's used globally. And for every product, it will provide a 6-digit number. It gets a full update. Well, it gets reviewed every 5 years. When I say a full update, it is a full update, although most codes don't change. But there can also be short-term updates. They actually, every month, there will be a kind of a brief review every month, but the major review is every 5 years. And the last time I think was 2022. So the next one will be 2027. I think I've got those dates right. So the first 6 digits are harmonized globally for every commodity. And then every country will have extensions to the 6 digits. In most countries, it will be extended to 8 digits for export and 10 digits for import. In various circumstances, it can be more than 10 digits. For example, sometimes imports into the EU can be up to 12 digits. So just to say that again, the first 6 digits are harmonized globally. Anything after that are national codes. In most countries, you have to declare up to 8 digits for export and normally 10 digits for import, but that can be extended to 12 digits. And as I've mentioned, the exporter and the importer have legal responsibilities to declare the correct code. Never rely on a freight forwarder or a broker or a third party to identify the code on your behalf. It should be the experts in the product who identify the code. And that's because the smallest difference in a type of product, a type of mineral, a type of metal, that can change the commodity code. And as I say, getting that code wrong, even by 1 digit, is an infringement of customs regulations, and there can be penalties for doing so. So, the issue for all of that, why I'm stressing that is because the commodity code triggers everything. It triggers whether there's going to be an export control or an import control. It triggers the rule of origin for that particular product. So it really does matter to get it right. Okay. Customs procedure codes in every. Oh, sorry, I can see another typo there. Forgive me. If you look at that bullet point, it says customs procedure code, COLE. It should be CODE, customs procedure code. So using the rest, and in any event, we abbreviate that to CPC, the customs procedure code. It may be the export or the import is a standard export or import. Normally, you export something to a country with the aim that it will be sold in the country of arrival and it will stay there. But it may be a temporary export or a temporary import. It may be goods for repair. It may be inward processing or outward processing. There are lots of different customs regimes, and the procedure code identifies the regime for the import or the export. Again, it's up to the trader to make sure the correct code is used. I've mentioned rules of origin, and we spoke a lot about this last week. Very, very important. Remember, a takeaway from last week. If you're asked to provide the non-preference origin of the goods, generally there's a legal requirement to do that for non-preference origin. If you're asked to provide the preference origin, it makes sense to do it because that would mean that the importer can generally get duty relief under a trade agreement. But you don't have to use it. It may be that there's a decision between seller and buyer, exporter and importer. Look, we'll just pay the duty. It's going to be easier to pay the duty and cheaper to pay the duty than to work out what the correct rule of origin is. And that happens. That's unfortunate. But that's generally the rule, that it's a legal requirement to comply with non-preference rules of origin if you're asked to do so. Complying with preference rules of origin, you only have to do that if you want to take advantage of a trade agreement. Excuse me. On customs declarations, you've got to show a product description that aligns with the commodity code of the product, so that, if there's a review of the declaration, the officer reviewing the declaration is going to want to see that the product covered within that declaration matches the commodity code. So using the correct product description is really important. On the declaration, the correct value has got to be shown as well, remembering that the value you declare for export is different to the value declared for import under WCO and WTO rules. So for export, it would generally be the FCA or FOB value. In other words, the value of the goods when they cross the exit border of the country of export. For import, the value that has to be declared is the value of the goods plus the international transport and the insurance. And the reason for that is because international transport and insurance are dutiable values under the rules of valuation. So if you align that with Incoterms, generally for export, it's going to be the FCA or FOB value. For import, the value that has to be declared will be the CIP, CIF, or one of the D terms, those values. In other words, the value including international transport and including insurance. It's also important on the declaration that the correct unit of measure of the goods is shown, is identified. Now, for commodities, for minor metals, normally it's going to be the weight. That's normally going to be the case, and it's going to be the unpacked weight, in other words, the net weight of the goods. It may be a different unit of measure. You've got to check according to the commodity code every time, but generally for minor metals, it's going to be the net weight. And another golden rule, if you like, and I'm giving you several golden rules, if you've got any doubt, particularly on things like the commodity code of the goods, or the rule of origin for the goods, then remember you can get a binding ruling from the customs authority under customs codes, every country, and also under the trade facilitation agreement, which we'll talk about a bit later on. Every country has to have a provision where if a trader wants a binding ruling on a commodity code or an origin of the goods, they can go to their customs authority and ask for a ruling. They may not like the answer to what the ruling is, but that's a way of ensuring you're using the correct coding. Okay, any questions, any comments so far? Okay, so some topical issues in relation to customs formalities. Um, the safe framework, the World Customs Organization's safe framework of standards. This was implemented in WCO countries, which is virtually every country in the world, in 2005, and implemented by the UK and by the European Union, by the UK as part of the EU and the USA, in round about 2008. I'll talk more about it later, but from a trader's point of view, the main product of importance in the safe framework of standards is the AEO concept, authorized economic operator. We touched on this last week. I'm going to talk more about this later on. But the concept of that is basically that any party or any organization which is party to an international supply chain can apply to become an AEO in their country. In different countries, they call it different things. Most countries, they call it authorized economic operator, but there's different terminology in different countries. In the USA, they call it CTPAT, the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. In Jordan, they call it the Golden List. So different terminology, but it's the same thing. It's the WCO safe framework where those involved in international supply chains, importers, exporters, freight forwarders, customs brokers, warehouse operators, they can apply to become AEOs. And if they meet the right standards, they will get an AEO, a trusted trade standard. And from that point onwards, their cargoes will be treated by customs as being low risk cargoes. So that's an important concept. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The Trade Facilitation Agreement, again, agreed by all the World Trade Organization states, again, virtually every country in the world. I'll talk about the detail of that later, but it really is important because the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, I think I mentioned last week, I always call that the most important trade agreement globally that no one has ever heard of. And it will have an impact on every supply chain globally. There is no doubt about that. So a really important agreement. Then we have actually in part of that agreement, part of the TFA, is that every country must have a single window system. Now, again, I'll talk more about that. I'll give you a bit more detail on that later on. But what you'll see when I talk about it later is the idea of that is to reduce the cost and complexity of international trade. And single window operations, or single window implementation, it takes a while to implement a single window and it becomes very expensive for the government concerned. Hence, for example, in the UK too, we don't have a single window in the UK. 2 years ago, a project was contracted to implement a single window in the UK. That project was put on hold last December, in December 24, because of financial constraints in the government here in the UK. We understand it's on hold, which means it will be continued at some stage, but it's on hold at the moment. Meanwhile, the European Union is going ahead with their single window. And it's a very, very good thing. The European Union single window, can't remember what it's called, what the acronym is. There's a name for it, begins with C. Can't remember what, but it doesn't matter. But it will connect customs authorities with traders in all the EU countries together. There'll be complete interconnectivity of customs authorities in all the 27 member states of the EU and with traders as well. Everything will be interconnected, and that will reduce the cost of doing import and export business. So to give you an example of single window, and I'm going to give you the Kenya example because they have a very good one. So, and I'll tell you a bit of the story behind this. And this goes back about 6 years ago in Kenya. So Kenya, again, is a country in Africa that globally people are getting very excited about. The economy is growing very, very quickly. It's doing very well. And, whereas a lot of markets globally are considered to be saturated, as I mentioned last week, many of the African markets and some of the Southeast Asian markets are seen as being the places for future growth. And Kenya is one of those countries. Now, in Kenya, and it does go back about 5, 6 years ago now, the economy was starting to grow. And the president at the time was very, very keen on the growth of the economy being export led. I mean, most economies are keen on that. Most economists to grow, they know that you've got to have export led growth. So the president did a bit of research and he could see the economy was improving, but he was frustrated at the speed of the improvement in the economy. It was very slow. And he spoke to people. He spoke to traders and asked them, why, how difficult was it to import into Kenya and to export from Kenya? And he got the same message. It was really, really complicated. Lots of documents, lots of emails, lots of telephone calls, lots of processes, lots of procedures. It took ages to import anything and it took ages to export anything. The president then went to his trade minister, who I met, and he's a very, very impressive guy. And he said to the trade minister, look, this is what I've heard from talking to traders. I want you to set up a project to map out the lines of communication for importers and exporters when they're trying to carry out their daily business. So the trade minister initiated a project, and what you can see on the screen is what he found. That, on the top in orange, you've got the public sector. I haven't put all of them in there just to give you an example. You've got some of the public sector players. At the bottom of the diagram, you've got some of the private sector players. And when he did some research and mapped out the communication needed, even for the most simple import or export, everyone's talking to everyone else, documents flying all over the place, really, really complicated. And the cost of doing business was really high, and the speed of doing business was really slow. The president saw this and he said, okay, we've got to do something about it. How can we improve this? And quite rightly, the trade minister said to the president, we need to have a single window platform. And this is what they got. So basically, by single window, they went from this situation to this. And in Kenya, they call the single window KenTrade. And rather than all this going on, what happens now is when you have an import or an export, the importer or exporter just sends all the consignment details electronically to KenTrade. KenTrade's an electronic hub, and it relays what the individual organizations need to know about that consignment. From the exporter or importer's point of view, they send the information once and once only. And that's what a single window is. And I can tell you a bit of a story about this. I got a bit involved in the single window implementation in Kenya. And there was a big launch event. It was a big deal. And there was a big launch event at a hotel in Nairobi. And I was giving part of the introduction to the event. The trade minister came along because it was a really important deal for Kenya to have this single window platform. And at the launch event, the minister was there, I was there, and the minister gave his talk to introduce the project and to wish it well. And then he sat down on the platform next to me and he said, "Really sorry, John, I'm going to have to go in a few minutes." He's a minister, he's a busy guy. And after a few minutes, he left the conference call. And as he was walking down the conference hall, I was giving my presentation. And as he walked down the conference hall, he stopped halfway down and he looked at me and he said, "Excuse me, can I just say one thing before I go?" And of course, I said, "Of course you can, Minister." And he looked at me and he said, "What we need here in Kenya is we need a single window, John, like you have in Europe." And I said, "Minister, we don't have a single window in Europe." And he was on his way out and he looked round again. He said, "What?" And I said, "We don't have a single window. You will be getting one far before we get one." And that turned out to be true. So Kentrade was online, I think, initially about 4 years ago. The UK still doesn't have a single window, and the European Union is implementing the single window, which is great. I think the implementation is starting towards the end of this year. It may go into next year. Single window implementations do take a long time. There can be a long lead time to them, but that's what a single window is all about. And just from that graphic there, if you think back to that, and also think back to the graphic I showed you right at the beginning on Monday about the complexities of procedures, to go to that environment is clearly a very, very powerful trade facilitation tool. So those of you in the EU, this is what you're going to have very, very shortly. Those of us in the UK, we're going to have to wait a little bit longer, could be quite a lot longer, until our country can afford a single window, and then we'll have one, hopefully. But under the Trade Facilitation Agreement, every country must implement a single window platform. Okay, any questions, any comments on that? Okay.
In a matter of time, maybe if I can add, maybe in a matter of time, how it fastened, make it faster, maybe the deals through the single window, or even compared to the other one, to the complicated one.
Well, it's going to be different in different countries. Yeah, I think you're asking what will be the time benefits. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, in general.
Yeah.
It fasten up business with, I don't know, months, days, weeks, or something like this.
Yeah, that's really, I'm not being evasive here, but that's really hard to answer because, single windows are different in different countries, the way they implement them. So in some countries, they only connect the public sector, in other words, the orange elements you can see on the screen at the moment, with maybe the importers and exporters, but not with other private sector organizations. In other countries, they connect all of them together. So it's going to be different in different countries, and it will also be different with different types of import and export. If there's no licenses required, if there's no trade agreements, there's no preferential rule of origin that has to be proven, then it's going to be a lot quicker than if you have to do those things. So I can't give a very prescriptive answer to that, but I can give you some idea that, for example, in Kenya, whereas if you look at so every year the World Bank do a survey, or they used to do a survey called the Ease of Doing Business Report. Now they call it Business Ready. It's not done every year now, but it's very, very similar. If you look at that report, one of the metrics they look at is the time taken to import and the time taken to export, the number of days it takes to carry out the formalities that you need to carry out to arrange an import or to arrange an export. And to give you an example of that, in Kenya, and this is an estimate, in Kenya, if you're an importer, generally to go through all the processes and procedures, all this stuff would generally take about 4 weeks before you could actually say, okay, we can go ahead with the import. Round about 4 weeks. Now it's generally about 2 days, 2 or 3 days. So you can see a vast improvement. And with that improvement, of course, you get reduced cost for the traders because you're saving the cost of doing business. So it will be different in different countries. But, in most countries where they've implemented a good practice, a best practice single window, it really is significant benefit, as you can see from that Kenya example. But,
Thank you. It's a perfect answer.
Yeah, but I do stress it's going to be different in different countries. And I'm just going to give you a view here, which isn't proven yet because it's too early. But for example, in the European Union, in the EU, trade facilitation is pretty good. Anyway, even without the single window, trade facilitation is pretty good. So in the EU, there will be a benefit when the single window is implemented, but the benefit won't be as much as in countries where trade facilitation is not so good. And that stands to reason. So, if we just go back to that, in the EU, it's not like that. It can still be pretty complex, but it's not like that. And therefore, the benefits that accrue to getting to this situation will be a bit less than we saw in somewhere like Kenya. And that stands to reason. So it is going to be different in different countries.
Thank you. Totally understandable.
Great. Thank you very much for asking. Really good point. Okay. So a little bit on some customs formalities, customs regimes, just in relation to the terminology that you may hear, just some examples, because there's a huge amount of customs terminology. Free circulation simply means that goods are free to be sold in the country in which they're located. So, for example, goods which are duty paid in any European Union country can move freely throughout the European Union. So if I'm in the European Union, if I import something from China, pay import duty on that product can then move freely all over the European Union. So free circulation simply means a product has come in from somewhere outside the country, it's been customs cleared, duties been paid, it then becomes in free circulation in the country in which it's located. That's all it means. GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences. Many countries, or actually not that many, but some countries have GSP regimes. The countries that have them are the European Union, the USA, Japan. The UK has one, but in the UK, we call it something different. We call it DCTS, which is the Developing Countries Trading Scheme. And all those things are really GSP schemes. And the concept of GSP means that a product can be imported from a developing country, generally a lower middle income country, a developing country, or a less developed country, and it will be given free access to the market concerned, whether it's the EU, the UK, Japan, the USA. In other words, there's free market access. When the product comes into the country of arrival, there will be no duty payable. And the concept of that is it helps developing countries sell their products into the developed markets like the European Union, because it gives duty-free importation into the EU. That means the developing country can export more because they're more competitive. That helps their economy grow. If their economy grows, eventually that means they can buy more from the countries concerned. So, we don't do it just to be nice. We do it for sound economic reasons. But if you hear about GSP, it's a preference system to enable developing countries to gain benefit from developed markets like the European Union, UK, USA, and Japan. And if you look at the UK system, if you look at the European Union GSP system, you'll see there's a whole bundle of countries which get GSP privilege, even some which shouldn't really have them anymore. China, under some circumstances, still gets GSP. India, under some circumstances, still gets GSP. Until a couple of years ago, even Saudi Arabia got GSP. So, historically, there have been countries in the GSP system that have got benefits from GSP, which have developed, their economies are doing really well. And as soon as their economies are doing well, they should be migrated out of GSP because they don't need it anymore. So that's what GSP is all about. We get quotas on various goods, on some metals, on steel, on some fabrics, on garments, and they're generally export or maybe export or import administered. And that means a certain value, or depending on the quota, a certain quantity, a certain value, or a certain weight can be imported at a lower or zero rate of duty during a period. Once the quota has been achieved, then the full rate of duty would be applied. That's what a quota is. And with quotas, the importer can apply to take benefit from a quota, and the importers really have to keep an eye on it to see how much is left on the quota. And generally, you get that from the customs website, the management system, which will say if the quota is open, if it's critical, or if it's expired. Open basically means there's quantity left on it or value left on it. Critical means it's nearly expired. Expired means it has expired and the full rate of duty will be payable. Then we have anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties. So there's a principle of the World Trade Organization that governments are not allowed to subsidize the manufacture of goods which are exported. So governments may subsidize goods which are sold on the home market, but if the goods are exported, governments are not allowed to subsidize the production cost. If they do subsidize production costs and the goods are exported, then the importing country is allowed to charge an extra duty. And that's to bring the goods to what's called a fair market value, as though the exporting government had not subsidized the production. So to give you an example of that, there's a belief by the European Union that in China, production, for example, of solar panels, and I mean, there are two big things going on at the moment, solar panels and tires, vehicle tires. And there's a belief in the EU that solar panels and tires, amongst other things, the cost of producing them is subsidized by the Chinese government. Because of that, when solar panels, as one example, arrive into the European Union from China, the normal rate of import duty for solar panels will apply. The normal MFN, most favored nation rate, will apply, but there will be an additional duty called an anti-dumping duty. And the concept of that is to bring their value up to the cost as though the Chinese government had not subsidized the cost of production. So it's all about fair markets according to World Trade Organization rules. It's a rules-based system. So if you hear the term anti-dumping duty or countervailing duty, which are almost the same thing, if you hear those terms, it's to bring the value of the goods up to a fair market value. Now, remember from last week, we spoke about when we were talking about the USA tariff situation, we spoke about the other very important rule of the World Trade Organization, and that's the rule of non-discrimination. And the rule of non-discrimination is that countries have to charge the same rate of import duty for the same commodity code product, whatever the country it comes from. You can't charge a different rate of duty because of the country of export, unless there is a trade agreement between the countries of export and import. Then you can charge different rates of duty. Otherwise, you have to charge the same rate of duty from every country. So we have free trade agreements and we have preferential trade agreements. And there are different interpretations of those phrases, free trade and preferential trade. But the most accepted trade agreement is that a free trade agreement is generally reciprocal, and that means it's in both directions. So, for example, the EU has a trade agreement with Japan, a free trade agreement with Japan, and that means EU goods arriving in Japan would generally be allowed free duty-free importation or lower than the normal rate. And also the other way around. Goods coming from Japan into the European Union would generally be allowed free import, no duty payable in the EU or less than the normal rate. That's a free trade agreement. It's in both directions. A preferential trade agreement is a trade agreement generally which is in one direction only. For example, GSP, the Generalized System of Preference, that's one direction only. Economic partnership agreements are generally one direction only. And that will be, for the example with GSP, it's for GSP countries when they export goods, for example, into the European Union under the GSP scheme, then there's no duty payable in the EU. However, EU goods going into that country will be subject to the normal rate of duty. So it's not reciprocal, it's in one direction only. But remember the key thing with both free trade agreements and preferential trade agreements, remember to take advantage of those trade agreements, the goods must meet the rules of origin. Okay, and remember, every trade agreement is going to have different rules of origin. So the rule of origin is going to be different for different products, and it's also different for different trade agreements. We touched on this last week. So really important for exporters, when you declare the preferential origin, you have to check the rule of origin to make sure that the goods meet the rules of origin. For importers, they've got to check that the declaration of origin made by the exporter is correct, that the goods meet the rules of origin. So that's really important for free trade agreements, for preferential trade agreements. Benefit can only be taken from those agreements when the goods meet the rules of origin. Okay, any questions, any comments? Okay, so earlier on, I mentioned the World Customs Organization's safe framework of standards, and you can see the aims of it. You can see them on the screen at the moment. Now, basically, the history is the scheme came about after 9/11. After 9/11, the world got really, really worried about supply chain security. It became a really big thing. The big thing, and we touched on this last week, is most goods that move around the world nowadays, certainly by weight, the vast majority of goods moving around the world are going to move by sea in containers, and no one knows what's in those containers apart from the person loading the container. So the world became really worried about the security of supply chains and didn't really know what to do about it. So the World Customs Organization was tasked with coming up with a framework that every country has to adhere to. And the framework they came up with was called the Safe Framework of Standards. And you can see what the aims of the Safe Framework are. They're on the screen at the moment. To establish international supply chain security and trade facilitation standards to promote certainty and predictability in international supply chains, to enable integrated supply chain management across all modes of transport, to enhance and in fact to improve the role of customs, its functions, its capabilities globally, to strengthen cooperation between customs administrations in different countries, to improve their capability to detect high-risk consignments, to have better cooperation between customs and business, and putting all of that together to promote the seamless movement of goods through secure international trade supply chains. And to achieve that, there are four main elements to the agreement. Firstly, we now have harmonization of cargo information. So customs declaration information for exports and for imports is now harmonized globally. In other words, when you do an export or an import, what you declare to customs in your country through the customs management system, that information capture is the same in every country. It's going to be things like the HS code, the value, the method of transport, the non-preference origin, the preference origin, the description of the goods. So there's harmonized agreement on the information that must be captured. The adoption of a risk management approach in addressing security threats. So all customs declarations in every country now, whatever the country is, they're done electronically into a customs management system. And that's a risk management system. And that system needs to be able to detect high risk consignments. And it will do that electronically. It will look at patterns. It will look at is something a little bit strange. For example, if there's an import entry or an export entry, the commodity code is for gold. 50 kilos of gold is shown as the weight, as the unit of measure, and as the commodity code, and the value declared is 200 euros. Clearly, something is wrong. The system will pick that up. Or if it's something which doesn't appear to be part of the normal practice of the importer or the exporter, the system will pick that up. So using a risk management approach. Mutual customs cooperation for the inspection of outbound consignments considered high risk. So an export declaration is made. That export declaration is transmitted to the importing country before the goods have been shipped. The importing country has concern. They say to the exporting country, please do an intrusive examination of that cargo before it's shipped, because we think that cargo may be high risk. The importer is a high risk organization. We want you to check the cargo before it's shipped. That's what that's all about. But the key element from a trader's point of view is the final one that you can see there. The conferral of benefits to businesses meeting minimum supply chain security standards and demonstrating good practice. And that's where we have these trusted trader schemes in the UK, in the European Union. We call it AEO, or Authorized Economic Operator. In the USA, it's called CTPAT, the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. But in most countries, it's called AEO. So, what does it take to become an AEO? What do you have to do to achieve an AEO accreditation? And it's different in different countries, but generally it's this package that you need to prove to customs if you want to become an AEO, an authorized economic operator. A generally good record of customs compliance. Now, it doesn't mean 100% perfect. Mistakes are going to happen. But what they look for is a generally good record. Do you use the right HS codes, the right rules of origin? Do you understand export controls, prohibitions and restrictions? All those kind of things. So a generally good record of compliance. If you have warehouses or storage facilities of goods which are going to be exported or imported, are they secure? Do you have secure systems? If you have your own vehicles to move goods to the docks or to the airport, do you keep them securely? Do you vet staff before you employ them? And do you train the staff in import and export practice? Well, all you guys on this course, you can tick that box straight away, because this course would, that would be a tick in the box for training of staff. So do you train staff in import and export practice? Do you have good policies and procedures which are published? For example, do you have a procedure for determining the correct HS code of the product? How often do you check that the code has changed or hasn't changed? Do you have a procedure for that? Is that part of your normal standard company procedures? If you, for example, check a customs declaration that's been made on your behalf and you notice an error, do you advise customs of that error, or do you just hope they won't notice? So do you correct errors? Do you have good access control to your premises, good record keeping, good inventory control for the materials that you're buying and selling and trading? Are your accounts up to date? All of us rely on electronic systems, IT systems. Are they sustainable? If there was a breakdown, could you check your inventory of goods imported and exported? Do you regularly do internal auditing? Do you look at yourself and say, what can we do better in our import or export practice? Is there anything we can improve upon? Do we need to update our policies and procedures? Are we giving enough training to our staff? So a regular internal look, regular internal auditing. And if you use subcontractors like freight forwarders, customs brokers, carriers, shipping lines, airlines, road operators, how often do you check them for their own compliance? Particularly if they're doing things like making declarations on your behalf. How often are you checking them to make sure they're doing the right thing? So That's generally the package that you have to prove if you want to get an AEO accreditation. And it's a good thing to do because there are loads and loads of benefits of being an AEO. Your consignments are treated low risk. And, if, for example, there's a delay with customs in a certain country, then you would get priority because you're an AEO. All your consignments would be treated as low risk consignments. So, in relation to customs formalities, and this is a UK example, but again, it's the same in every country. When you're looking at importing goods and the role of customs, um, with customs clearance, the process is very, very similar in every country. Every import consignment will be given a clearance route. I'll show you a diagram later, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So there will be a clearance route, and that route will be an indicator of how the consignment is going to be treated on arrival. So there'll be a customs route, and I'll expand on that in a few minutes. In the UK, we've just migrated to a new customs system called CDS, which is the Customs Declaration Service. The old system's called Chief. Now we've got a new system, CDS. And one of the main features of CDS, and this is the same in most countries, certainly in the European Union, a bit different in the US, but very, very similar in most countries. With the migration to CDS, it makes it easier for traders themselves to do their own declarations. Okay, in the UK at the moment, it's very, very usual to use a freight forwarder, a broker, an agent to use a declaration. With CDS, you need training to do it, but it's much, much easier for traders to have direct access into the customs management system. Remembering that part of the responsibility for customs in every country is revenue collection at import, where there is revenue to be collected. There may not be, but where there is. And also to carry out the ASN, the anti-smuggling net. And do remember, when customs use the word smuggling, they don't just mean misdeclaration of value things or misdeclaration of the product. They also mean, even getting the commodity code wrong by one digit, that's smuggling. From a customs perspective, you're smuggling if you do that. So those are the two basic responsibilities of customs, the anti-smuggling net and also revenue collection. They'll also electronically look at duty and VAT valuation and calculations, and there can be certain kind of reliefs they can give. For example, when goods are, and again, this is the same in every country, there will be things like inward processing reliefs. And the concept of inward processing is that if you import something, which is then going to be exported, you don't pay import duty when you import it because you're going to be re-exporting. And that's what inward processing relief is all about. So if you import a material, a metal from a country, and you do some processing to that metal, and then you re-export it, you bring it in under inward processing, you don't pay import duty because you are actually going to process and then re-export. It's not going to stay in the country of import. That's what inward processing is all about. And that's one example. There's also outward processing relief, returned goods relief, temporary admissions, temporary imports, temporary exports. There are a lot of these reliefs available in every country. A little bit about valuations. Do remember that when you import products, when you import goods, the import value is the value of the goods plus the international transport and the insurance, if there is any insurance. So, remember, there'll only be insurance under CIP or CIF in most cases. Maybe under D-Incoterms, there'll be insurance. But the important thing to remember is that both the international transportation and the insurance, both of those things are dutiable just as much as is the value of the goods. Okay, so duty is payable based on the valuation, based on the transactional value. And when we talk about the transactional value, we mean the selling value from the seller to the buyer when the goods cross the international border of import. So valuation is basically the way to put that really is it's going to be based on the invoice value of the goods, the first sale value. If the transactional value can't be determined under the rules for valuation, in every country, customs authorities can base their calculation on the value of identical goods or also on the value of similar goods. So if they can't determine the actual transactional value, they're allowed to say, well, okay, a similar amount of that metal was imported from the same country last week. We're going to base the valuation on that value, on the value declared for that import that happened last week. If there aren't any identical goods, they can look at similar goods and base the value on similar goods imported from the same country. So those are additional, and there are additional options available, but the rule is under the rules of valuation, customs have to take them in order. So what that means is if the transactional value is available, and normally it will be from the commercial invoice, then customs have to base the valuation on that value. Only if that isn't available are they allowed to look at identical goods. Only if that's not available are they allowed to look at similar goods. So they have to take the rules of valuation in order. Remembering that the valuation of the goods, the level of duty, the rate of duty will depend on the HS classification of the goods concerned. So just to get you thinking for a minute, let's think about this. The CFR or CPT value of the consignment is 10,000 US dollars. The insurance premium is $100. The import duty rate in the country of import is 3%. Quick calculation, how much duty would be payable? So who wants to give me an answer to that? So let's think about the thought process. The CFR or CPT value is going to include the international transport. So we know that's included in the $10,000. Insurance is estimated as $100. And that means the dutiable value is going to be $10,100. That's going to be the dutiable value. So how much duty do we think is going to be charged on that consignment? Who can do the calculation? Yeah, go. So, oh, I thought someone was going to answer then. I didn't hear anything.
I'm sorry. Is that $303
Exactly.
as an input duty?
Exactly. You win the prize today, $303. So the thought process is $10,000 is the CPT or CFR value. And we know with CFR and CPT, it includes international transport. So we know the international transport is included in that figure. Insurance is estimated at $100. And that means that the dutiable value is $10,100. The rate of import duty in this case is 3%. 3% of $10,100 is going to be $303. So the import duty payable would be $303. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, so clearance procedures. And again, this is going to be similar in every country. And it's really, this is quite an old graphic. Don't worry about that. The bit to concentrate on here is 2/3 of the way down. You can see it says Route 1, Route 2, and Route 3. And every country will have a similar system. And that is a consignment will arrive in a country, or it could be a pre-arrival declaration, because under the Trade Facilitation Agreement, every country has got to allow for pre-arrival declarations. So an import declaration will be made into the customs management system. And that system will give the goods a route on how they're going to be treated when they arrive. And here, because it's the system they used in the UK, it's a bit different now. But the terminology used in the UK was route 1, route 2, or route 3. It doesn't matter what we call it. Every country will have a similar system. In some countries, they call it green route, amber route, red route. They call it different things in different countries. But it comes to the same thing. So with one route, it means there will be a documentary check. In other words, customs want to have a look at the documents covering that consignment before they clear them. That's what route 1 is. If customs are really concerned about the goods, they may want to do a physical examination. In the UK, we call that a route 2. If they don't want to do any checks and they're just going to clear the goods based on what they can see in the declaration, then it becomes a route 3 checked, a route 3 clearance. Okay, no checks, cleared straight away. Basically, within an hour, they're going to be cleared straight away. And the World Customs Organization, they give guidelines on this. And the guidelines are in every country, not more than 17% of imports should have a documentary check. In other words, a route 1 check. Around about 17%. Not more than 3% of imports should have a physical examination. In other words, a route 2 check. 80% of imports should have no checks at all. In other words, route 3. And that's global guidance. 80% of import consignments should have no checks. The customs declaration would be input into the customs management system, and clearance should be very, very quick after that. Now, clearance and release are two different things because the goods can be cleared, but depending on the country concerned and depending on the importer, for example, are they an AEO, there could be a delay and it may be that the goods won't be released until duty has been paid. If the importer is an AEO, or if the country allows it, it may be duty can be subsequently paid. But in some countries, it may be that even though the goods are cleared, they won't be released until the import duty has been paid. And that's going to delay things. Or maybe the release has been delayed because the bills of lading aren't available and it's a sea shipment. That could be a reason for delay as well. But if none of those things apply, then if it's a route 3 check, which should apply to around about 80% of cargoes, then goods should be cleared very, very quickly. In the UK, in the EU, in most countries, the target for route 3 is going to be round about an hour or less for clearance of route 3 cargoes. And that just gives you an example of what the tariff can look like on a printout. Okay, any questions so far?
Maybe I want to ask.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, after you.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask maybe a question what I'm used to meeting in normal business life. That is there a possibility maybe when a country outside of the EU want to import here something, I need to go to our country to custom clear it, or it is possible to make maybe on the side of the exporter of the country to not being able to, because every time if we are importing some goods maybe from Turkey here to in European Union, we need to make custom clearance. Yeah, we need to make it maybe, for example, for here in Slovakia, and then going to deliver it maybe to the client. And my question was that if there is a possible, and every time, of course, they need to be physically there, so to check it. Maybe the route 3 is what I want to ask. That what are the needs? What we need to match to maybe being able to be faster the road, to maybe not want to go to the custom clearance to another country, or maybe not need to be there physically to show them the stuff or the material what is going to be imported, or I don't know if I'm right. I don't want to make it longer. I don't know if my question is right, that if there is a possibility maybe to do the customs maybe outside of Europe when it's going to be imported, to not go maybe to another country where we need to custom clear it, and then after we delivering to the customer, maybe to lower or shorten the period, the roads.
Yeah, I'm not too sure what you mean, but basically clearance has to be carried out in the country where the goods arrive. You know, if they're going to enter that country, you know, if they're in transit, it's different. But if they're going to enter the country, okay, so if you're in Slovakia and the goods are going to enter Slovakia, then you've got to go through the clearance process.
Okay, but finally, if it goes to Hungary, maybe the final destination is to Hungary. But first, I need to custom clear it maybe in Slovakia, maybe because of the contracts with the customs organizations, you know, to be able to custom clear it, and then I can only deliver it to the client. So my question is that is there a possibility to maybe shorten this procedure?
Yeah, I'm just not clear, Peter. So you're bringing it into Slovakia from Turkey.
Yeah.
And then you're selling it to somewhere else. Did you say to Hungary?
Yes, in Hungary.
Which is in the EU.
Yes.
So if you clear it in Slovakia, it becomes in free circulation, and there should be no more implication when you sell it on to Hungary. You can just move it freely to Hungary. Or you could have it imported directly to Hungary because it's going to end up there anyway and do the clearance in Hungary. I'm not sure why you're bringing it in.
Because the first is the case which we are normally using and it works. So it is the normal way how we do it. But maybe in the second way, to deliver it directly to Hungary, it especially lowers my expenses on the transport, of course. But maybe in this case, the client has to have maybe some contract with some custom clearance organization where we need to come and custom clear it there. Am I right? Or
the importer, you know, going back to last week, as long as it's not a DDP export from Slovakia to Hungary, as long as it's not DTB, then the importer must do the import clearance. They have to do that. So if the goods go direct to Hungary, then the importer in Hungary does the import clearance, unless you're selling it to them under DDP, which would mean you would have to do the clearance. But bear in mind, I think I remember that you weren't there last week. But it's really difficult with being the importer of record in another country. You would probably have to register in Hungary. You may have to set up a company in Hungary to arrange the clearance. That could be the issue there.
Yes, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, that would be the issue, I think.
Yes. That's the issue, that you need to open up a new company in the exit country with a new VAT and everything else.
So I mean, I think, you know, there are two alternatives really. One of them would be that the buyer in Hungary, so that you get the goods shipped directly from Turkey to Hungary, not under DDP, and the buyer in Hungary does the import clearance in Hungary. That's one thing. Or you bring the goods to Slovakia. If the goods are getting examined every time, that means for some reason it's being triggered as high risk. So in that case, my advice would be check you're using the correct commodity code, check customs procedure code, check the description, check the origin is really Turkish origin under rules of origin, because there might, you know, if they're examining the goods every time and it's delaying things, that makes me think that the customs management system in Slovakia has identified that something is wrong. There's something worrying. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing examination every time.
Okay.
And not, sorry, just to give you a third option there.
Perfect. So thank you. Go on.
Yeah. So a third option could be becoming an AEO, because then as long as you meet the requirements, then your consignments will be treated low risk anyway, and they won't be doing that examination every time. So I think those are going to be the three options to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I'm asking about the EO situation, what it needs to be done on our side to maybe help to fasten this process.
Sure. But, you know, do bear in mind, if you take the AEO option, remember, it's an EU in the European Union. AEO is a community regime. So if you're an AEO in Slovakia, you're recognized as being an AEO in every country in the European Union. There's mutual recognition.
Okay, perfect.
So that could be a way forward.
Okay.
Something
I
to
explore
think
these
about.
options.
Okay. And there was another question, I think, from someone.
Yeah, it was a question earlier you mentioned about the HS codes and how the
Yes.
first 6 digits are harmonized globally,
Yep.
and then the additional sort of like 2 or 4 or 6, depending on which country, digits following that are national.
Yep.
When you've got sort of a bit, I'm just thinking like when you've got a bill of lading and you're shipping, let's say from the EU to the Far East, or
Yeah.
for example, the initial 6 digits will be the same between the exporting and importing country, but the following digits might be different within those at the exporting and importing country.
Yes.
What if sort of on the bill of lading, what would you include? The export, or does it not matter really what codes you're using on the bill of lading? So you've got to give a code to the shipping line. Do you give them the full code from the importing country or from the exporting country, or does this only really matter when you're doing your import and export declarations?
Okay. The first thing is you do not have to put an HS code on a bill of lading. If a shipping line asks for that, my question to them would be why. We don't have to do that. It goes back in history a little bit, because some shipping lines, they used to charge freight rates depending on the commodity code. They used to do that. That's a really old-fashioned way of determining the freight rate. So I think my first question would be, why are they asking for that? If they do insist, which would be fairly unusual, it could be for other reasons. It could be because they want to determine if the goods are, classified under IMDG as being dangerous goods. That could be a reason, possibly. So what I would say is the answer to that is if they say that it's got to be there, then I would say just give the HS code, in other words, the first 6 digits, because they're harmonized globally. No one can misrepresent you. Then when the goods arrive at destination, the importer can't say, well, that's what the exporter said, and bung them into their system when it's wrong for their system. So what I would say is just enter the codes which are, if the shipping line insists on it, just enter the HS codes that are harmonized. In other words, the first 6 digits. But I would also ask the shipping line why are they asking for it? Because there is no international regulation that you have to show an HS code on a bill of lading. That's pretty unusual. So Joshua, I would just recommend you do those 2 things.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, I'm not involved in the shipping team. I just
I
get the presumption that they're always asked what the HS code is when making bookings, but
so I would get your logistics people to ask the shipping line, why are you asking for that? There may be a good reason, and it could be the dangerous goods reason. But also, there's no international requirement to be on the bill of lading. If they insist on it, there's no harm the HS code being on the bill of lading. But as I say, I would restrict to 6 digits from the country of export. Okay, because the bill of lading, basically is the bill of lading as at the port of loading. So I would enter the HS code as at the port of loading, which is going to be the export. Is going to be the it could be up to 8 digits, as I say, but I would restrict to 6 digits. Then there'll be no misinterpretation when the goods arrive at destination. That would be my guidance on that.
Understood. Thank you.
That's okay. Great. Thanks a lot, Joshua. Any other questions or comments before we break? Some really good points coming out. So thank you for asking those things and making those comments. Okay. I can't see anything else. So let's break now, please. And we will reconvene in 30 minutes, and that will be 3 o'clock UK time, and that's UTC +1 for those of you outside the UK. So we'll reconvene 30 minutes, and thank you very much for your attention so far.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.
All right, I'll see you half an hour. Hi, William. We're on a break at the moment until 3 o'clock UK time.
Okay.
So we'll reconvene in about a quarter of an hour.
Perfect. Thank you.
Lena, are you there? Lena?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Hi, Dana.
Lena, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Even though we're in break? Can you hear me? It's Dana Lehrman. I feel terrible. I was an hour late. It's a long story. I had the alarm set and something went wrong. So I've
Oh,
missed
I'm
the
sorry.
first hour. But
Well,
this
it's
is
all right. This session is being recorded, so I can share a recording with you afterwards and you can catch up on
good.
what you missed.
Thank you. That's what I was going to ask you. Just I'm terribly sorry. Thank you. Okay, go take a rest of your break.
All right. Absolutely.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. So just a couple more things on customs, then we'll move on to transport and insurance and documentation. A few times I've mentioned the Trade Facilitation Agreement, the TFA. I'm not going to go into huge detail here, but as last week, you will get copies of the pack, and if you want to look at the detail, you can do that. But the background goes back quite a long time, actually. And the main purpose of the World Trade Organization, if you said to them, what's your ultimate aim? What do you really want to achieve? When they were established over 50 years ago, they would have said, we want global free trade, because everyone could see the benefits of that. And they've certainly been really successful if you look at average import duty rates, and of course, the duty rate depends on the product, it depends on the country of import and whether there's a trade agreement. There's lots of variables. But average duty rates have gone down considerably. About 50 years ago, an average duty rate would be 20-25%. Now an average duty rate is about 2 or 3%. So, of course, with some products, it's going to be a lot higher, some a lot lower than that. But that's the global average. And probably about 12 years ago now, the WTO considered, okay, we've probably gone as far as we can on getting near to global free trade. We'll never have global free trade, but we've got as near as we can. What other barriers are there to international trade? And they looked at the non-tariff barriers, and it was quite right they did that. And they appreciated that actually, and this is a theme which you'd have seen over the last sessions, the cost of doing international business can be really high because of processes, procedures, customs formalities, having to prove that you've done the right thing, documentation, all these kind of things. They really are a cost to business. And the WTO recognized this and they said, okay, we've got to have an agreement on the non-tariff barriers, not the tariff barriers. We've done probably as much as we can on duty rates. Now let's have a look at the other things which make international trade expensive. So they bought out the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and the agreement's got, as I say, I'm not going to go into huge detail, just so that it exists really. But it's got three major aims, three objectives: to speed up the movement, release and clearance of goods traded internationally, to improve cooperation between customs authorities and other regulatory bodies, and to build capacity globally to make international trade more facilitated. So those are the stated aims of the agreement. And what's interesting here, without going through the details of the timeline, suffice it to say that the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement was the first trade agreement, the first international agreement, which came into force early. No other international agreement has ever done that. Round about the end of 2016, if people said to me, when do you think the agreement will come into force? I and people like me who were commentating on it said probably about 2020, 2021. But the WTO rule is that when 2/3 of the membership agree to something, it comes into force. And what happened was at the end of 2016, suddenly the EU ratified the agreement. That meant 27 more countries had ratified it. Because the EU ratified it, a bundle of other countries ratified it in January 2017. And because of that, the agreement came into force in February 2017, much, much earlier than anyone ever expected. And that really goes to underline, I think, how important the agreement was. And countries, nations, realized the importance of the agreement. So there was a rush to ratify it, and it actually came into force in February 2017. And in the agreement, there's about 13 articles. And within those articles, there are about 70 activities governments have to do. And on the screen at the moment, I've just picked out, 6 of the activities out of those 70. And you can see what the activities are that I've selected. And underneath them, you can see the reduction in the cost of doing business when those activities have been implemented. So again, not going through all of them, but for example, if you look at the first one, simplifying trade documents, Okay, that reduced the cost of doing business by 3% for low income countries, 2.7% for lower middle income countries. Streamlining border processes, even for OECD countries, a cost reduction in 1%. Remember, OECD are the richest countries in the world. Automating trade and customs procedures, OECD countries, cost of doing business reduced by 2.1%. So as you can see, just picking out 5 or 6 measures out of the 70, you can see even just for those ones, a really big reduction in the cost of doing business. And that matters for traders. It means all your processes and procedures become simpler and the cost of carrying them out becomes less. Now, you probably can't read all of that, but basically the structure of the agreement is 3 sections. The first section are the technical articles. The second section are the rules for developing countries. And this is another interesting side to it, because many developing countries who are members of the World Trade Organization, they said to the WTO, okay, this is a really good agreement, but we're only Cambodia, or we're only Nigeria, or we're only Venezuela. It's really hard for us to implement the agreement. So we need to have a light version of the agreement. The WTO said no. They said absolutely not. The whole point of the agreement is that every country achieves the same standards in trade facilitation. So they said to developing countries, absolutely not. You have to achieve the same standards and the same requirements. However, we will give you more time to implement them. And if you need technical assistance to implement them, we, the World Trade Organization, will make sure you get that technical assistance. So section 2 is all about timescales and technical assistance for developing countries. And finally, section 3, that's the requirement that every country must establish a trade facilitation committee. And that committee is made up of public and private sector, and it will hold the government to account on implementing the agreement. So every country has one of those. The USA has one, the UK has one, the European Union has one in each country. Every country will have a trade facilitation committee. Some are more active than others. I'm involved in the UK one, and because I get pretty shouty about it. When they don't implement something they should have implemented, I do shout. Well, no, I don't shout. I try not to shout, but I do make the emphasis that to UK Customs, to the Department of Business and Trade, you really need to implement that very, very quickly. So that's what Section 3 is all about. Section 3 is a committee, public and private sector, that holds their government to account on implementing the trade facilitation agreement. Now, most of the approximately 70 requirements are compulsory. The agreement says government shall do it or shall not do it, but some of them are qualified. As you can see on the right there, some of them it will say implement this to the extent possible, or you're encouraged to do it, or implement them as appropriate. They tend to be the more minor parts of the agreement. But all the major parts of the agreement, governments are told, you shall do it, you shall do this, you shall implement a single window, you shall not delay consignments when they arrive in a port if you've got some queries about the clearance document. You must allow them to be delivered and then consult afterwards. So most of the provisions are mandatory. Government shall do them or shall not do them. And there on the screen, you can see a summary of the articles, what they're all about. Again, no time to go into huge detail here. But for example, Article 1, I think is going to be very, very impactful. And Article 1 says that every country must have a platform from which traders can get every bit of information they need in relation to exporting to any country and importing from any country. That platform should also allow them to make declarations, apply for export licenses. So in other words, it should be combined with the single window. And if any information is required, it should only have to be entered once. Now, When that's fully implemented, that's going to be really, really powerful. We don't have that yet in any country. The nearest we have is the European Union. Some of you will have used the Access to Markets database. And the Access to Markets database is really starting to implement Article 1. And then we have things like, very briefly, Article 2, opportunity to comment. Customs cannot bring in a new regulation until they've consulted with the trade on that regulation. So they can't say from tomorrow we're bringing in this new rule, this new restriction. There's got to be a consultation process. Advanced rulings, Article 3. If you want to get a ruling on something, then customs have to give it to you. Again, as I say, I'm not going to go into any great detail here. Article 7 is a very, very long article, all about the clearance and release of goods. And it's about things like implementing a single window, which we spoke about earlier today, allowing pre-arrival processing, that you customs clear goods before they arrive. You don't wait till they arrive and then start the clearance procedure. You clear them while they're on the high seas. You clear them before arrival. Payments must be allowed to be made electronically and so on and so on. Risk management systems have to be used. Cargo should not be delayed at ports, airports, inland clearance depots. If customs have any concern about a cargo, they should allow it to be delivered to the importer and then resolve the issue afterwards, so that you don't get big demurrage bills, big port detention bills, and so on. AEO, it states that there's got to be good benefits for companies that are AEOs, and there must be good trade facilitation measures. I say no great detail, but if you look at Article 12, customs cooperation, if you look at the last point there, it mentions GNC. That stands for globally networked customs. And that means, and this isn't going to happen quickly, but it means that eventually every customs authority globally will be interconnected with every other customs agency. Now, the beauty of that, it means we're getting away with this crazy situation where if I'm an exporter and you're an importer, I do an export declaration from my country and you do an import declaration in your country. But both those declarations have virtually the same information because it's the same consignment doing the same thing. The only thing that should be different is maybe the last few digits on the commodity code and the valuation, because the import valuation is going to be including transport and insurance, but everything else should be the same. So the main concept of globally networked customs is that when I do my export declaration, that automatically becomes the import declaration in the importation country. We no longer have two declarations. The export declaration automatically becomes the import declaration. And that has a lot of benefit. It saves having to do two declarations. It cuts down on fraud. It reduces the opportunity for errors in declarations and so on and so on. So that's what GNC is all about. So that's Article 12. We then have 10 articles for developing countries about longer time scales, getting technical assistance if they need that. So, countries like Zambia, Congo and East Africa, which export a lot of minerals, a lot of very high value and some lower value metals, that's really important to them. They're getting technical assistance in improving customs operations. So there are 10 articles about that, and Article 23 about establishing trade facilitation committees. Okay, any questions at all on customs operations before we move on? Okay, so moving goods around the world. And again, there's, many of you, this is your everyday business, you know all about this. But I think with green shipping becoming more and more important, there are gradual changes that we're seeing. But what are the options? Well, you can see the options on the screen at the moment. And certainly, by far, by tonnage, sea freight is still the most prolific way of moving goods around the world. And when we talk about sea freights, there are different ways of doing it. And the two main differentials, if you like, are liner shipping and charter shipping. Let's take the second one first. Charter shipping is a bit like hiring a car. It's when you charter a ship, you need to have enough cargo to do it, but you charter a ship just like you would rent a car because you've got enough cargo to fill a ship that you want to move. And you charter the ship on a voyage basis or a time basis. A voyage basis means you're chartering it from one port of loading to a port of discharge. That's called a voyage charter. Or maybe you want to charter the ship for a period of time, for a number of voyages, and that would be called a time charter. And normally nowadays you would charter a ship with the crew. It'd be a full charter with the crew. So when you're dealing with bulk commodities and large tonnages of bulk commodities, it may be that you would charter a ship to do that. But you need to have the volume to do it to make it cost effective. Okay, so the main type of shipping we have is called liner shipping. And liner shipping is where basically you're paying for the space you take on the ship and only for the space your consignment takes on the ship. And the definition of liner shipping is when a ship, a vessel, follows a route, and at every port on that route, it will discharge some cargo and it will load some cargo, and it follows a timed schedule. The kind of thing all the major shipping lines do. MSC, Maersk Line, Evergreen, CGM, did I mention CGM? All the major shipping lines, that's liner shipping, and you pay for the space you're taking on the ship. And again, with liner shipping, we can break that down into container shipping and bulk shipping. Sometimes bulk shipping is called conventional because it's the old-fashioned way of moving goods before containers were invented. But of course, not everything will fit in a container. So there's still a need for bulk shipping. There's not so much availability as there used to be, because now I think it's, virtually true to say, if a consignment will fit in a container, it will probably be shipped by a container. Even if it's a liquid, it will be a tank container. If it's a raw material like coffee beans, I did some work on the coffee value chain. Coffee beans, the way they ship those, for example, from Ethiopia into Europe, is they get a 20-foot container. Then there's a big plastic line that goes in that container. They call it a bladder. And they have a machine, and that machine shoots the coffee beans into the bladder. And they shoot 20 tons in. It's fascinating to watch. They shoot 20 tons of coffee into the bladder. They have another machine that sucks all the air out. They seal the bladder inside the container and they close the container doors. And that's how coffee is shipped nowadays. It was quite interesting. I know you guys aren't involved in coffee, but it was interesting. I watched this being done at Djibouti port, and I was really impressed with it. And I was saying to the guys at the port who were showing me around, this is really impressive. This is state-of-the-art machinery. And one of them said, yeah, it's great till it goes wrong. And I said, oh, does it go wrong regularly? And he said, well, the thing is, when you shoot the coffee into the bladder, you've got to get the speed exactly right. Otherwise, you no longer have coffee beans. You end up with instant coffee, which isn't what's being sold. So I think they had to get it fairly accurate. But the point I'm making here is that nowadays, if a consignment will fit in a container, it's probably going to be shipped by container. Bear in mind, remember from when we spoke about Incoterms, container shipping is multimodal. It's door to door. The container will be loaded at an inland point. It will then go by road or rail to the port of loading. It will then go on a ship to a port of discharge. It will then take its final delivery by road or by rail. So it's multimodal. It's unit load transport. It's much, much cleaner and more secure than conventional shipping. So that's sea freight. Most goods are shipped by sea. Remember, the overall quality of sea freight is it's slow, but it's cheap. That's the way to look at sea freight. And it can handle large volumes. Now, however the cargo is moved, there's probably going to be a road element to the journey. In some cases, the whole journey may be by road. Road freight, the advantage is it can be door to door if it needs to be door to door, which is an advantage. But of course, very, very big environmental issues. And because of that, now there's global policy and a lot of programs going on to get cargoes off the roads onto the railways. You know, the biggest program, of course, is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative between Southeast Asia, between China and Europe. The Belt and Road Initiative, a huge, huge initiative. But, you know, it's based on getting cargoes off the roads and doing most of their journey by rail. And it will have a really big impact when it's implemented. We have air freight, of course. Air freight is the most expensive way of moving goods around the world, but it's the quickest. And remember, of course, one of the things to bear in mind is to look at, or, you know, as one of the metrics, to look at the mode of transport in relation to cash flow as well. Because remember, when a cargo is moving by sea, when it's on the high seas, it's got no, you know, I was going to say it's got no value to anyone. Well, of course it does have value, but it's no use to anyone while it's on the high seas. But when it's on an aeroplane, it's going to get to most places in the world within 24 hours. So that means the receiver of the cargo can get value of the cargo much, much quicker than if it's shipped by sea. So, of course, the freight's going to be more expensive, but there may be financial reasons why it's better to move it by air than by sea. There can, you know, just to get value for the goods much, much more quickly. And then we have multimodal. Container shipping is multimodal. It's road, rail, and sea, you know, so it's multimodal. The fastest growing multimodal system is actually sea air. That's really growing as a multimodal system, where the cargo does, for example, half the journey by sea and the other half by air. It's getting increasingly used between the Far East and Europe. It's cheaper than moving the cargo the whole way by air freight, but it's quicker than moving it the whole way by sea freight. So it's very, very much a compromise, but growing very, very quickly, in fact. And the two biggest sea air hubs is one in Singapore. There's a very big sea air hub in Singapore, and the other one at Jebel Ali in Dubai in the Emirates. A third is likely to open somewhere in Africa. It's not clear quite where that's going to be in Africa. I would put money on it. Well, not quite yet, but I may put money on it being somewhere in West Africa because of the way the economies are developing there. So sea air growing in popularity. And just some pictures, a standard road train, which is the terminology. Interestingly, different countries have different rules on the maximum weight you can have in road vehicles. So the unit you can see there in the picture, that would be completely legal in most European Union countries, but that would not be legal in the UK. In the UK, we have stricter rules on the amount of weight you can put in a vehicle on the UK roads. So, you know, we don't have harmonisation on axle weights. It's different in different countries, but that's what a standard road train looks like. There's a cargo aircraft. In fact, most air freight is carried on passenger aircraft. You know, where your luggage goes on a passenger aircraft, there's loads of room under there for cargo. And in fact, sometimes, you know, it's true to say that passenger planes, even if they haven't got one passenger, if their cargo hold is full, they can still be profitable on that journey. But there's a cargo plane. Not everything will fit into the cargo hold on a passenger plane. Sometimes cargo planes have to be used, and there's an example there. And there we have a block train. And as you can imagine, the big example of rail freight is it's much more environmentally friendly than road freight. So all the cargo you can see in that picture, if it was moved by road, it would be about 50 trucks, all spewing their emission all over the place. But put them on a railway and it's faster, it's more efficient, and it's more environmentally friendly. The disadvantage is, of course, the train can only go from railhead to railhead. There is going to be a rail journey before and at the end of the rail journey. But having said that, it's going to be a much, much shorter journey. And of course, some big manufacturers, like the steel manufacturers, they actually have rail sidings going into their works. So, as I mentioned, a really big incentive globally, lots of work being done on moving cargoes off the roads and onto the railways. Last week, you'll remember these pictures from last week when we spoke about Incoterms. Then we have conventional sea freight, the old-fashioned way of shipping where the cargo is moved directly into the hold of a ship. If you charter a ship for your commodities that you're selling or buying, if you charter a ship, then it will be conventional sea freight. The material, the metal, will be loaded directly into the hold of a ship. If it goes by container, it will be container shipping, it will be liner shipping, and you only pay for the cost of your container on that particular ship. It's quite an interesting metric, actually. You know, I always think, and I use this generally when I speak at conferences, it's quite interesting to look at what the big shipping lines are buying in relation to the size of vessels they're buying. After COVID, there was a really strong feeling that the shipping lines would cancel their orders for the very, very big post-Panamax vessels, for the biggest types of container ship. But they didn't do that. They didn't do it. They've gone ahead with the orders for the biggest post-Panamax ships, container ships. So container ships are continuing to get bigger and bigger. And that is actually a metric of the way economists see international trade progressing, which is a good sign. You know, I wouldn't say scientifically it's particularly 100% accurate, but it's a really, really good overall indicator. So that's interesting. The picture you can see there, that's by no means the biggest size container ship you get nowadays, but that gives you a kind of idea of a medium-sized container ship. I think you all know what a container looks like, but if you don't, that's a standard container. There we go. And that's a seal that you put when you've loaded a container. On the left-hand side of the picture, you can see the old-fashioned seal, still used, the very kind of flimsy steel band that you put around the locking point on the container. But nowadays, you tend to get bolt seals like you can see on the right. And the whole concept of containerization is that one of those containers, it gets loaded at origin, and it will be sealed at origin with a seal like that. And the seal should be intact when the container arrives with the final user, with the end user, with the consignee, with the importer. Now, if customs want to inspect the cargo, what they have to do is they have to break the seal, do their inspection, and then they have to reseal the container with an official customs seal and a declaration that they have inspected the cargo. But if there's been no customs inspection, you know, one of the key things that we train importers is when you receive a container into your warehouse, always make sure the seal number on the seal is the same as on the bill of lading at the time of export, because that shows that the seal hasn't been broken during the transit of the goods. It's a very, very elementary check, but it's a really important one. And every insurance company will ask for that if there's a claim. Did you check the seal number before you broke the seal on the container? So it's a small thing, but it is quite important. You know, really, really important that we look at the security of cargoes. That really does matter. You know, again, a very important theme now is supply chain security. So trends in logistic and distribution. The use of third and fourth party logistic providers, which has always been there. And I think, you know, when you're a manufacturer or a trader, an importer or an exporter, then there's always been a choice. Do you arrange shipping yourself directly with the carriers, directly with the shipping lines, the airlines, the truck companies, the rail companies, or do you use a freight forwarder, a third-party provider? And, you know, there are pros and cons, of course there are. Again, because of time, you know, we can't go through all of them. But I think, you know, the key thing is if you use a third-party provider, you rely on them to have, you know, for example, an agency network around the world. You rely on them to have good knowledge on the transportation of goods internationally and the procedures involved in that. And also, of course, the big thing is they may have better buying power with the carriers than you have. They may not, but they may do. So when they go to Maersk Line, they can say, we're going to ship 5,000 containers with you this year to Maersk Line, and Maersk Line will give them good rates, which they can pass on to you. Or it may be that you can get better rates than they can. But generally, they should be able to negotiate better rates than you could get directly. So that's the kind of advantage of using a third-party provider. Disadvantages, of course, you can lose control. That's the first thing. Secondly, you may be able to get better freight rates than they can. And, depending on your volumes of traffic, it may be you can negotiate with carriers better than a third-party provider can negotiate. And it does, as I say, it does give you that control. You're doing everything right because you're doing it yourself. So, there's a balancing act there. There's no rule there. It's what's best for your company. The theme in the 21st century has been just-in-time logistics. No one really wants to have to warehouse goods anymore. Or at least manufacturers, they want to reduce the size of their warehouses and reduce the size of their stock holdings. Because warehouses are expensive, you have to buy them or you have to rent them, you've got to heat them or light them or cool them, there's got to be people working there, you've got to guard them. There's a load of expense that comes with warehouses. And of course, if you hold stock, you're tying up capital. So if you look at the major manufacturers, and the best example of that are always the automotive companies. If you look at the truck making companies, they all work on just-in-time logistics, where all the components arrive just in time from their suppliers for when they need them on the production line. Now, the danger with that is that if the components don't arrive just in time, then there's only one alternative: they're just too late. There's nothing in between. You've got your BMWs on the production line rolling off the end, and there's one rivet they need. If that rivet doesn't arrive just in time, the production line will come to a halt. So just-in-time logistics, the intention is good, but the reality is you've got to have good, strong scientific logistics, which the automotive companies had, but they came a cropper in a big way during COVID. When points of supply couldn't supply anymore, the ports closed, and suddenly they couldn't get their components. And because of that, in Europe, to an extent in America, there's a move towards what's called near-shoring. And a lot of the major manufacturers are currently looking at the situation. Do we really want to be reliant on the Far East? Can we afford to be reliant on the Far East? Or should we look at having production much, much nearer the final manufacturing point and having our suppliers much, much nearer the manufacturing point in America and in Europe? And that's why there's so much interest at the moment in West Africa, because that would be a logical place. So just-in-time logistics, it's the way the world is going, but if it goes wrong, it does go very, very, very wrong. That's the issue. And I have to say, there is a school of thought now that maybe just-in-time logistics have had their day. There is a school of thought in that maybe it's not the way forward. It's just too dangerous. And I think those discussions, I'm not sure I agree with them, but those discussions are always worth having and debating. And in fact, I'm involved in a debate on one of those discussions next week, which will be interesting. Okay. Smart intermodal logistics solutions. I think I mentioned last week that in the olden days, if you like, but it wasn't so long ago, most shipping was arranged on a port-to-port, airport-to-airport, railhead-to-railhead basis. Nowadays, people want door-to-door increasingly. If you order something from Amazon, you don't expect it to arrive at an airport and you have to go and collect it, or arrive at a warehouse and you have to go and collect it. You expect it to be door-to-door. And that's how commercial freight is becoming now. More and more, if you look at international supply chains, there's far more requirement for door-to-door shipping, and that needs smart intermodal solutions like the one I mentioned a few minutes ago, sea air. We've got freight rate volatility. We've had that since COVID, really, with freight rates going up and down. a lot of the shipping lines a couple of years ago were saying they nearly went out of business because they couldn't increase the freight rates as much as they wanted to, and they were struggling in a very, very big way. Did I have sympathy with that? Not really, for lots of reasons. But now there seems to be more of an equilibrium with freight rates. There's still some volatility, but they're more stable than they were 2 or 3 years ago. One important thing to remember is that if you use third-party logistic providers and those providers give you value-add services, for example, and very usually they make the customs declarations for you, remember they do that as your direct representative. And that means if they make a mistake, they won't get into trouble, you will. They're doing the export entry or the import entry in your name. Okay, so the golden rule is that if you do use third-party logistic providers, don't rely on them for information like what is the HS code of your product? What is the rule of origin? Don't rely on them for that. You know your product. You're in the best place to identify the correct commodity code to make sure the rule of origin is correct if you want to take advantage of a trade agreement. Because remember, if they make a mistake, you get into trouble, they don't. And the takeaway from that is if you do use brokers to do your import and export declarations, always get a printout of the declaration so you can check it to make sure it's correct. You know I've said this a few times, I promise I won't say it again, but if they make a mistake, you're the guys who will get into trouble with customs. So it's always good to do that as a practice. Get a copy of the declaration, check it, make sure it's correct. If there's any errors, then make sure the error is corrected in the correct way in the customs declaration. Okay, so very importantly, green shipping, a really important theme nowadays. Lots and lots of, as you can imagine, lots of work being done on this. And I'm not a technical expert on this, but when you read about the shipping industry, having ships run by electricity, as opposed to other ways of powering them, there are very, very big technical problems with that. The main problems are battery problems, having batteries big enough to do it. So green shipping, a huge amount of work being done on that, but I think we have to be realistic. The move from road to rail I've spoken about, but there's still going to be an element of a road journey. I was doing some work last year, the year before last, in Zimbabwe, and they're looking at really increasing their road haulage, of having legislation to encourage the use of electric road haulage. Now they know to do that, they're going to have they're going to need lots and lots and lots more charging points around the country. They know that, but they're really putting in some very, very good research into stopping diesel, petrol, road haulage vehicles and going to electric units. That's one example. And the other thing we're seeing is that global buyers are starting to say, we will not buy goods which have been shipped by air. So going back to Kenya that we spoke about earlier on this afternoon, a very, very big export for Kenya, or two very big exports, are floriculture, which is flowers. Virtually every flower sold in Europe at certain times of year has been grown in Kenya. It's a really big industry for them. And also produce, tropical fruits, those kind of things. Now, a lot of the UK and European supermarkets have said to their suppliers in Kenya, okay, currently we're chartering aircraft to move the produce or the flowers from Kenya into Europe. And they've started to say, now we want them shipped by sea. Don't ship them by air anymore. If you ship them by air, we're not going to buy them. And the technology is there. If you use reefer containers, refrigerated containers, maintain the correct ambient temperature in the container, and you've got to have the fruit or the flowers at the right state of ripeness, if you like. But as long as you meet those requirements, they can be shipped by sea in reefer or chilled containers, and they will arrive 3 weeks later in the European ports in fresh condition to be sold in the supermarkets. And that trend is growing. where importers are saying, ship them by air, we're not going to buy them. We want them shipped by sea. Do your homework on it. Find out how we can ship them by sea safely. Ship them by sea safely, because that's what we want. So a very big subject, but green shipping and of course green ports. Green ports is a very big subject. Last year I spoke at the Green Port Convention. It's a very, very big subject, making ports greener, because ports use a huge amount of power. So all that work is currently going on. Okay, any questions about transport, logistics, or distribution trends? Okay, so cargo insurance. Of course, remember from last week, responsibilities in relation to Incoterms. Remember, the Incoterm governing a contract shows where the risk passes from seller to buyer. And there's always a case to say that it makes sense to insure the goods as a seller or as a buyer for the part of the journey where you hold the risk. Having said that, do remember that there are only two Incoterms which make insurance compulsory, and those are CIP and CIF. The clue is in the I. If the Incoterm's got an I, then insurance is compulsory. And also, thinking back to last week, remember with CIP and CIF, the exporter must insure the goods even though they don't have the risk under those terms, but they're insuring the goods on behalf of the buyer and against the buyer's risk. It is the buyer that would make the insurance claim. So that's the response, that's the relationship of Incoterms and insurance. Incoterms will identify very, very clearly where risk passes from seller to buyer. Having said that, only two Incoterms where insurance is compulsory, CIP and CIF. Having said that, it does make sense to insure the goods as the seller or the buyer for the element of the journey where you hold the risk. Now, in terms of accessing insurance cover, there are different ways of doing it. If you're a prolific trader, importer or exporter, you probably have an open cover policy with an insurance company. And an open cover policy means generally you have a 1-year policy. On that policy, it will list the countries you're buying from or selling to. It will list the type of cargoes, and it will give you a rate schedule for insurance for those movements of cargoes. And every month you declare the cargoes moved to the insurance company. They send you an invoice and you pay them on a monthly basis. So open cover gives you a kind of overriding insurance policy. Or you may have specific cover, and that means you get transactional cover for every consignment that you have that needs insuring. You don't have an overall policy, but every time there's a cargo, you get an order, you get a cargo, you insure that specific cargo. There's no right or wrong there. It really just depends on the volume of traffic you're moving. If it's large volumes, it makes sense to have an open cover. If it's not large volumes, it may be better for you just to insure every cargo one at a time. You have a CIP or CIF transaction. When you insure a cargo, it will be insured for the transit risk. In other words, the standard risk of getting lost, damaged, broken, water damage, whatever that may be, plus the war risk. The war risk will always be included. So if the journey takes the goods into a conflict area for interest, for example, the Black Sea area, the Red Sea and so on, then the war risk element of the insurance is going to be higher. If it's low risk, for example, like the Atlantic, the war risk is going to be lower. So with the insurance rates, they're going to depend on what the commodity is, where the cargo is going from and where it's going to, how it's being shipped, and the risk perceived by the insurance company. Depending on all of that, they will give a rate for the insurance. And the rate for the insurance, that will be a percentage of the value of the goods. In insurance, there are standard insurance clauses that are used globally, and these are called the Institute Cargo Clauses. Those are standards that are used all over the world. They're issued by the Institute of London underwriters, but they're used globally. Okay, they may not be called the ICC, the Institute Cargo Clauses in every country, but every country will have something similar based on the Institute Cargo Clauses. And for ocean freight, for sea shipping, there are 3 clauses, A, B, and C. There are 3 levels of insurance. A is the highest level, it's all risks. C is the lowest level, it's total loss of the cargo only. And B is a compromise, it's something in the middle. And again, if you remember from last week, do remember that under Incoterms 2020, a very big change. If it's container shipping, it must have Clause A insurance, which is all risks. If it's bulk non-container shipping, then Clause C insurance is adequate. Because if it's non-container shipping, if it's bulk shipping, then the likelihood is that it's going to be bulk goods. They have a low value in relation to their bulk. It's going to be a CIF consignment, not CIP, and Clause C insurance would be satisfactory for that, and it's cheaper. So that's the big change in Incoterms 2020. Container shipping is CIP, and it will be Clause A insurance. Bulk shipping is CIF, and it will be Clause C insurance. Let's just go back. General average. Who's heard of general average? Anyone heard of it? Okay, let me talk for a few minutes about general average. So, occasionally, a ship can be put in danger, and to mitigate that danger, the captain of the ship may decide to jettison some of the cargo. In other words, to throw the cargo overboard. And the concept is the captain would jettison some of the cargo to save the rest of the cargo and to save the ship. And there are some quite recent instances of that. So the concept of general average means that if that's the case, the captain throws some cargo overboard and it saves the ship and the rest of the cargo. The captain then declares general average. And that means that everyone who's got a cargo on that ship whose cargo has been saved has got to pay a contribution to the companies whose cargo has been lost overboard. Because some people's cargo has been lost to save your cargo, so you have to compensate them for the loss. The shipping line declares general average. And that means when the ship arrives at destination, when it arrives at the port of discharge, the importer cannot take delivery of the cargo until they've paid the general average contribution, which can be very, very high. If the value of the cargo is high, the general average contribution can be high. But the importer won't be allowed to take delivery until they've paid their general cargo contribution. Sometimes the contribution can be higher than the value of the cargo, in which case the importer may say, I'm not going to take delivery. It's daft. You know, I'm going to have to pay more of general average than the cargo is worth. Now, the good news about that is general average is an insurable risk. And that means if the cargo is insured, the insurance company will pay the general average contribution. If it's not insured, the importer has to pay it, otherwise they can't take delivery, and the cost can be really high. So if you hear the term general average, that's what it's all about. You know, it always takes people by surprise when they get a letter from the shipping line. You know, you've got a container on ship so-and-so going from this point to another point. Your bill of lading number is da-da-da-da-da. The captain has declared general average. Your contribution is going to be $25,000. And you will not be able to take delivery of your container on vessel arrival until you've paid that contribution. It takes people by surprise. But as I say, the good news is it is an insurable risk. That's what general average is. And then exclusions. You know, like with any insurance policy, there may be exclusions. And, you know, the golden rule is, like with so many things, if it seems too cheap, it's probably too good to be true. So if the insurance seems very cheap, have a look at what's covered. It may be the insurance company have put a load of exclusions on it, which could virtually invalidate the insurance. So always beware of exclusions. Most policies will have some exclusions and they can be very, very fair. But if there are too many exclusions, and if those exclusions are too burdensome, then it can virtually, eradicate completely the power of the insurance. So remember, in relation to Incoterms, only CIP and CIF make insurance compulsory. Remember, with CIP and CIF, the seller procures insurance, but it's for the benefit of the buyer because the buyer holds the risk. And remember, CIF, which is for bulk goods only, is going to be Clause C insurance. CIP is going to be Clause A insurance. Also remember, under Incoterms CIP and CIF, the goods must be insured for a minimum of 10% above the contract price. So if the contract price is $100, you must insure the goods for a minimum of $110. Okay, if you want to insure for 20% above the contract price or 30%, you can do that. But it's got to be for a minimum of 10% above the contract price in case of price escalation if the buyer has to reorder the goods. And do remember, we looked at this the other day when we looked at Incoterms. Under Incoterms CIP and CIF, it's very, very clear. Insurance shall be contracted with underwriters or an insurance company of good reputation and entitle the buyer or anyone else having an insurable interest to claim directly from the insurance company, simply because the buyer holds the risk. The insurance is on behalf of the buyer, and therefore the buyer must be able to make the insurance claim, even though the seller has contracted the insurance. And as I say, the insurance should be as a minimum 10% above the contract price. Also remember, from the importer's point of view, when making an insurance claim, importers are required to take prompt action. For example, if the car goes in a warehouse and the roof is leaking, the importer would be expected to move the cargo from somewhere where it won't get wet. However, if the warehouse is on fire, the importer would not be expected to rush in and rescue the cargo from the fire. That would not be reasonable. But prompt, reasonable action by the insured is always a key element of an insurance claim. Complete and accurate documentation, and that includes using an appropriate Incoterm. If there is an insurance claim, the insurance company will want to see good contracting, good documentation, accurate documentation, and legal documentation. Remember, when you're importing, those of you who do import, never sign a clean receipt for the cargo until the cargo has been checked. A typical situation, the truck drives in with your cargo on it. The driver says, come on, offload, offload, I want to drive away. And you say, hang on, I need to check the cargo. The driver says, no, I've got to go. Please offload straight away. You're rushed into offloading. You haven't got time to check the cargo. The driver pushes for a signature. Never sign a clean receipt unless you've checked the cargo. The golden rule is if you haven't got time to check the cargo before the driver wants to go, always write unchecked or cargo not yet checked before you sign that receipt. That way, if there is anything wrong with the cargo, you can make an insurance claim. If there is a claim, always advise the insurance company immediately. And a little game that we play is if you want to make a claim, always hold the last carrier responsible. So you've got a shipment arriving at your warehouse. It's moved by container, then by road to your warehouse. It arrives at your warehouse. You see you need to make an insurance claim. One of the things you have to do is hold the last carrier responsible, which is probably going to be the road haulage company that delivered the material to your warehouse. You write to them and hold them responsible. Even if you know they weren't responsible, you still do that. It's a bit of a game. They will probably write back to you and say, we refute responsibility, and they will hold the previous carrier responsible, which may be the port authority. They will write back to them, we refute responsibility, and hold the previous carrier responsible, which could be the shipping line. Everyone goes back and back and back. And the reason why it's important to do that, because it means if the insurance company or when the insurance company pay out on the claim by the importer, they can then at least make a partial recovery from the carrier under carrier's liability. That's why you have to do that. But if you don't make a claim on the last carrier, then the insurance company can't make a recovery from them. That's why it's important to do it. So that's really what it comes down to. Insurance is important. There's a relationship between Incoterms and insurance. We can see where the risk passes, but insurance is only can pass through with CIP and CIF, but it's hugely, hugely important. And some wonderful pictures to really underline the importance of insurance. Things can go wrong. Containers don't float well, except when they've got one of your very heavy metals in. Probably they might float for a couple of minutes before they sink. Do remember, incidentally, look at that picture on the top right and also on the bottom left. Remember, insufficient packaging, if you pack your metals or your minerals, whatever they may be, if you do pack them, remember, insufficient packing is never an insurable risk. If your goods haven't got sufficient packaging, you will not be covered by insurance. The insurance will be invalid. You've always got to make sure that packing is sufficient according to the transit and the mode of transport. There we've got a railway accident, as you can see. That ship was on fire. This ship is still on fire. There we've got a road traffic accident. That incidentally, and this one here, these are two examples of when general average was used. I spoke about general average a few minutes ago. If you look at APL China on the bottom right, they had to throw into the sea, I think it was about 100 containers. So everyone else who had containers on that ship, there's about 5,000 containers. Everyone else who had containers had to contribute to the loss of those who had their containers thrown into the sea. General average declared when the ship was saved, when the APL China arrived at destination, everyone had to pay their general average contribution before they could take delivery of their containers. And in some cases, the contribution was really high. So that's just something to bear in mind. My favorite picture, which unfortunately caused me a great deal of embarrassment, because I used this picture when I was talking at quite a high profile international logistics conference. I had this slide in my slide set and I hadn't realized there was another speaker because they changed speakers. I hadn't realized there was another speaker speaking after me who actually came from Maersk Line, the shipping line. So he got very upset when I used this slide. I did apologize and we made friends afterwards. But as you can see, it's not great, but there we go. So just some pictures. Incidentally, this picture you can see at the moment is interesting. This aircraft crash landed at Heathrow about 10, 12 years ago now, and no one was hurt. It landed short of the runway. But the reason why it's interesting is that purely coincidentally, I met the British Airways cargo loss adjuster at a conference a few months later. And bearing in mind that's a passenger plane, air cargo is carried on passenger planes. And as you can see, the cargo holds are at the bottom of the plane. And this guy, the loss adjuster, he told me that on that aircraft, there was 300 consignments of air freight, 300 separate consignments of air freight. And he told me only 3 of the 300 had adequate insurance. All the cargo was completely lost. All of it was damaged. But he told me only 3 out of the 300 consignments had adequate insurance. The rest of them just relied on British Airways liability. And remember, carrier's liability is a very, very low level. Remember, carrier's liability of cargo is based on the weight of the cargo, not the value of the cargo. So you will never get a full recovery if you just rely on carrier's liability. So that's something quite important, because I hear it quite often. People say to me, "Oh, I haven't insured the cargo because the shipping line, they've got a liability, or the airline, they've got a liability, or the rail company, they've got a liability." And it's true, they have a carrier's liability, but it really is a low level of liability. It's not the same as having proper cargo insurance. There we go. So before we move on to documentation for the final session, any questions on insurance?
Maybe not a question, but finally it works. Those general insurance works like on the roads with a car. Yeah, maybe in the European Union to be expression that everybody gives his money to the one who is going to crash.
To the cheapest freight cost.
To the cheapest, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And isn't that true? That's such a true comment, isn't it? What I always say, Peter, is that, of course, freight rates are important. They really are important because of competitiveness, but you get what you pay for. That's a reality as well. And I think this is really true when we talk about the international transport of goods. And what I always say to people is, if the freight rate is lower than is the normal rate, there's going to be a reason for that. Of course, there's a reason. You do get what you pay for. You really do. And buyers and sellers need to realize that. They really need to realize that you may get a very, very low freight rate, but the reason for that could be because the trucks aren't up to standard, they haven't got a good bonding, so the carrier's liability can be very, very low. They're not professional in what they do. They've got loads of pickup points, there could be lots of reasons for that. Yeah. But I'm glad you made that point because I think it's so true. In international transport, you do get what you paid for, you really do. So thanks for identifying that.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions or comments?
What is the best insurance, let's say, or for against the theft? Because many insurance companies do not cover that.
They will cover theft under Clause A insurance. Clause A is virtually all risks. So if you get, and in fact Clause B as well. Clause C won't cover that, but Clause A insurance and Clause B insurance that will cover theft. Again, as always, it's a really good point, and thank you for asking. That's a really good point. Always look at it. But I think when insurance is being contracted for the movement of goods, it's always important to state what clause you want, and always good to look at exclusions. But I'm glad you raised that because, from my point of view, I would always say, always make sure that the coverage does include pilferage and theft. Supply chains can be long. If we think back from last week, they can be quite fragmented as well. So you've got loads of activity points, loads of critical points in the supply chain. And that can mean there's lots of, if you like, what's the right word? There are a lot of points where there could be theft or pilfering of cargoes. So really good point to check that pilferage is actually covered.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question, how to avoid, let's say, because very often insurance companies started to kind of, when it's theft is appeared, they wait for the police decision or some courts. Is there any remedy, I would say, in order to push the insurance companies to pay as soon as possible?
Well, yeah, it's another good point. I mean, they have insurance companies they've got to follow due process, which is fair enough. And that could mean doing cargo surveys, which is very normal, doing inspections, that's very normal. They may want to see documentation, all that kind of stuff. But in most cases, it should not be a prolonged process in most cases. And again, I think it's a really good point. You get what you pay for. When contracting an insurance company, it's always good to ask them, and look at surveys and see what is their record of claim success. What is their speed of meeting claims? That's really important. The Trustpilot kind of thing. How well do they do? If you make a claim on day one, how many days or weeks will it take, or months even, to get the claim paid? So that's why in Incoterms it mentions using an insurance company of good repute, good reputation. Because if you do that, then, there's a kind of presumption that they can pay claims fairly quickly. But it is the same with any kind of insurance, because all insurance companies reinsure. They all do that. And they want to make sure they can get a recovery. So what I always say is, if you contract the insurance with a good insurance company, good reputation, you have to do that under Incoterms. If you make sure that an appropriate institute cargo clause is used. Make sure there aren't inappropriate exclusions. Make sure your documentation is complete and correct. Make sure you're using an appropriate Incoterm for the contract. Then the claim should be able to be pursued very, very quickly. But if just one element of that isn't as it should be, that can delay the whole process. But a lot of it, I think, comes down to selecting, an insurance company that does have a good reputation. A lot of it is dependent on that.
That's the matter. So especially on CIP conditions, when it's your supplier make a decision concerning the insurance company, especially some regions like Central Asia, where we do not have the access to internationally reputed companies.
Well, they should do. I mean, I think, it goes back to the contract really, where, if you're buying CIP, then they have to carry out the insurance. If you're not happy with the insurance they provide, then buy CPT, and then you can arrange the insurance yourself, in Europe or wherever you are. But even if you buy CIP, then you can lay down the conditions of the insurance, and if they don't provide insurance with the correct level of insurance that you've agreed in the contract, then they're in breach of contract. But I think it's a good point. And what I would say is, if you're not confident of the level of insurance that could be contracted in the country of supply, then buy CPT instead of CIP and arrange the insurance yourself.
Okay, thank you.
Because someone's going to have to pay for it. So
Yeah.
whether they pay for it and they charge you for it, or you just arrange it directly, I think that's what I would do. If I'm not happy with the provision by the seller, I'd arrange it myself, I think. Does that answer that okay?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you
Really
for your
good,
advice.
very welcome. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then very briefly, a quick look through documentation. Again, it's quite a big subject, but we'll just do a quick flip through it all. In international trade, I think we can, there's a bundle of documents which can be, even in the most simple transaction, there can be a lot of documents involved. And the way I tend to divide them is between movement documents and commercial documents. So movement documents, the best way to think about that, they provide the ticket for the journey. I think we may have touched on this last week. Just like when you're a passenger on a bus, a plane, a train, a boat, you get a ticket for the journey. Cargo has a ticket as well, and that's the movement document. And with cargo, the movement document depends on the mode of transport. So if it's sea freight, we're going to have bills of lading or express bills of lading. If it's air freight, we're going to have airway bills, house airway bills, or master airway bills. If it's road freight, we're going to have road consignment notes. And if the countries concerned are signatories of the CMR convention, they will be based on the CMR document. For rail freight, we're going to have COTIF or CIM notes. And for deliveries to freight forwarders, particularly under FCA consignments, we're going to have forwarders' certificates of receipt. So the transport document is going to be dependent on the mode of transport. But every transport document has some things in common. They're very, very similar. They'll always have things like who is the consignor, who is the consignee? What's the loading point and what's the discharge point? Who is the carrier? The name of the ship, the flight number, the rail wagon number, the truck number. What are the goods? What is the weight of the goods? What's the measurement of the goods? Have they been dispatched? Those are going to be the key points on the document. So every transport document will have that in common. And the key thing they'll have in common is they'll provide evidence of the contract of carriage. So when the bill of lading or the airway bill or the road consignment note or the rail consignment note, when they're issued, they evidence the contract of carriage between the cargo owner, depending on the Incoterm, the seller or the buyer, and the carrier themselves. Now, the conditions of carriage will sometimes be on the back of the document. So, for example, with some bills of lading, if you look on the back of them, those will be the conditions of carriage. No one ever reads them until something goes wrong, but that's where the conditions of carriage will be. If they're not on the back of the document, by law, the document must refer to them. So if the conditions of carriage are named on the document is allowed to say, subject to our standard conditions of carriage, you will find these at website da 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 da. So even if the document itself doesn't have the conditions of carriage, it must allude to what the conditions of carriage are and where the trader can find them. So whether it's road, rail, sea or air, the document is evidence that there is a contract of carriage between the contracting party and the carrier themselves. There'll be evidence the goods have been shipped. There'll be evidence the cargo has been received by the carrier. And a bit unusual now, but in some cases, they could be the freight receipt as well. In other words, receipt of the freight invoice. That's quite unusual now, but occasionally you see that. Now, as I said, the document issued by the carrier would depend on the mode of transport. Now, let's get rid of the easy ones first. For road, for rail, for courier shipment, for postal shipment, you simply get a receipt for the goods, an indication of dispatch of the goods. So for air freight, it would be an airway bill. If it's issued directly by the airline, the carrier, it's called a master airway bill. If it's issued by a freight forwarder on behalf of the carrier, it's called a house airway bill. Legally, they both have exactly the same standing. Okay, so it doesn't matter if it's a master airway bill or a house airway bill, they have legally the same standing. They're a receipt for the cargo and a notification of dispatch. Road freight, very, very similar. As I mentioned, it's a CMR note. Rail freight, a CIM note. Courier receipt, it's going to be a courier note. Postal receipt, it's going to be a postal receipt. Now, the big difference is with shipping line bills of lading. With a negotiable bill of lading, those are different to every other transport document. The big difference is if it's made out in a certain way, a bill of lading can be a negotiable document and a document of title. Negotiable document means that ownership of the goods can be changed by using the bill of lading. And that integrates with the fact that it can be a document of title. And because of all of that, when a cargo, a sea cargo, arrives at destination, legally, the consignee can only take delivery of that cargo if they submit one of the original bills of lading to the carrier. That's called surrendering the original bill of lading. So they're exchanging the original bill of lading, which represents the cargo, they're exchanging that for the cargo itself. And legally, when a consignment arrives at a port, legally, an importer cannot take delivery until they have surrendered an original bill of lading, not a copy, one of the original bills of lading to the carrier. They can't take delivery under any other circumstances legally. So that's a very, very key difference between bills of lading and all the other transport documents. And I think you all know what bills of lading look like. As you can imagine from what I've just said, a bill of lading is a really important legal heavy document, which has an intrinsic value. And that's why the examples I'm showing you, that's why, you know, before the shipping lines would give me the samples, that's why they put the word specimen on them. Because a bill of lading, when completed, an original bill of lading, is a hugely important document. If I've got an original in my hand, if I find one in the street outside my house, in theory, I can pick it up, I can go to the port of arrival and demand the shipping line give me the goods by surrendering that original bill of lading, because it can give me title to the goods, but only if I'm named on it or if it's endorsed to my order. So a really important document. There's another example. They're all very, very similar. There's a standard layout for bills of lading. All very similar. There we go. If you charter a ship, if you've got enough cargo to rent a whole ship, that's what a charter party bill of lading looks like. It has a different legal standing to a liner bill of lading, but you know, if you drill down, the information is going to be virtually the same. And there's a copy of a road consignment note just so that you know what one looks like. Okay, we then have commercial documentation, and there's a bundle of it. So, for example, you can see some examples there. We can have documentation to prove the origin of the goods. And that can be documents like a GSP certificate, an EUR1 document showing preferential origin, a certificate of origin showing non-preferential origin. You know, there's a bundle of different documents you can have. In the European Union, there's a gradual migration of paper proof of origin to electronic, and that's called the REX system used in the European Union. And that's, you know, gaining traction globally. We're seeing more and more of that. Quite interesting. You know, sometimes you see developing countries overtaking developed countries. And in relation to proving origin, it was the SADC region of Southeast Africa that started to have electronic proof of origin. You know, and they've had that for about 10 years now. In Europe, it's relatively new. So that's quite interesting. So in the EU, as I've mentioned, gradually migrating to an electronic system called REX. Inspection certificates, I think on the course we've got someone from an inspection company. If the goods need inspection prior to shipment, if pre-shipment inspection is required, then of course some kind of clean report of inspection or report of inspection, which may be a non-negotiable report or report of findings, will be issued. Sometimes there may be a requirement for a traceability certificate or a test certificate. A packing list is a standard requirement. And of course, there will always be a commercial invoice. We'll come on to that in a minute. And if it's a CIP or CIF transaction, there will be a requirement for an insurance document. So export invoices, what's going to be the standard content of an export invoice? And this is what you would expect to see on an export invoice. And most of it, I think, is pretty obvious. There's going to be a description of the goods and the quantity of the goods or the weight of the goods if it's a commodity, the addresses of seller or buyer, the method of payment and currency of payment. We're going to talk about payments tomorrow, of course. The Incoterm governing the contract, remember, made out in the way we spoke about last week, 3-letter code, subject to Incoterms 2020, and the named place of final destination. So that's going to be on there. Any statements, different countries have different requirements. You check, I'm selling to China. Do I have to put a declaration on the invoice? Some countries, it can be a small declaration. I hereby certify this invoice is true and correct. So you have to look at country regulations. Is a special declaration needed? If you're trading within the European Union, you have to put VAT numbers of seller and buyer. The packaging units, weights and dimensions, they don't have to be on the commercial invoice in most countries. Generally, you can have a separate packing list, but you know, why not combine the two? It makes things easier and have everything on one document. It makes sense to do that. There may be destination country requirements. For example, you may have to give a complete breakdown of price, maybe from FCA to CIP value. You show the FCA value, then you show the freight cost, then you show the insurance cost, then you show the total CIP. Some countries have that requirement. So there may be a destination country requirement. You may have to show preference and sometimes even non-preference origin, depending on whether you're claiming a preference. Commodity code, always good to put that on the export invoice, up to 6 digits. And remember, some countries still require signed invoices. Signatures are going out of date. Most countries realize signatures aren't necessary, but some countries still need signed invoices. So my recommendation is always the same thing. If in doubt, sign the invoice. It can't do any harm. And there are some examples of documents. A standard non-preference certificate of origin, the layout tends to be the same. When the UK left the European Union, we had to have our own document. So that's a UK certificate of origin. But whether you're in the States, whatever country you're in, non-preference origin will have the same kind of format of certificate of origin. And that's what they're going to look like. There's an example of an EUR1 for claiming preference within the European Union. Again, they're still in use, but in the EU, there's a migration to the electronic REX system for proving origin. So EUR1s currently still in use, but they are dying out and most countries that have trade agreements with the European Union have gone over to the electronic system. And there's an example of a GSP certificate. I'm sorry, it's a bit cloudy because it's a green document and it doesn't really scan very well, but that's what it looks like. And there's an example of an insurance certificate for a CIP or CIF transaction. No standard layout of an insurance document, but they tend to look like the one you can see on the screen. Very, very straightforward. You would have on there the name of the conveyance, in other words, the name of the ship, the flight number, the rail number, or whatever, where it's going from, where it's going to, marks and numbers of the consignment, description of the goods, and the insured value. And it will be signed. If it's CIP or CIF, it will be signed on the back by the exporter so that the importer can make the insurance claim. Remember, with a document like that, always look for exclusions. If you think the insurance rate is low or it seems too good to be true, even if you don't, even if you think it's a good, it's a reasonable rate, always look to see if there are any exclusions. There we go. So that's it for today. This is what we're going to cover tomorrow. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And as I hoped, we've got some minutes left. So any questions or comments, any worries, anything going to give you nightmares tonight in relation to what we've been speaking about?
No nightmares.
No nightmares. Okay, glad to hear that. So that's it from me, except that once again, thank you all very much for your attention, which I really appreciate. Thank you for that. Tomorrow, everyone should be really excited because we're talking money tomorrow. Export credit control, how you get paid, and letters of credit. That's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. And the intent tomorrow is we'll follow the normal format. But at the end tomorrow, I really want to try, we'll see how the timing goes. Hopefully we can kind of finish me talking at about 4 o'clock UK time tomorrow. And then we'll have half an hour, I hope, where we can take any Q&A for the whole 4 modules that we've done. So in the meantime, thank you very much for your attention, everyone. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thanks, Paulina, for managing the whole thing. And over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for today's seminar. If any questions arise in your mind afterwards, please feel free to put them forward tomorrow to send them to me, and I can put them across. We reconvene tomorrow at the same time, which is 1 p.m. UK time. That's 1 p.m. BST. That's UTC +1. And the slides will be available after tomorrow, and I'll also prepare the recordings for you so that they can be shared. If you haven't had access to recordings, although I believe I've enabled your access, if you haven't had it yet, please let me know and I'll enable you to access it. So that's it. Have a good evening, and I'll see you all tomorrow.
Thanks, Paulina.
Bye.
Nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you and wish a happy day. Ciao.
Bye now.